Hello everyone, and welcome to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about the translation of Bloodborne. Since the last episode ended right before we picked up what's going to be one of our main weapons for this playthrough, I thought it only fair that we start this one by taking a closer look at its item description. Once again, I'll be reading a more literal translation aloud, with the official one on screen. Tonitrus, a unique trick weapon made by Archibald, who is known at the Healing Church workshop as an eccentric. This odd iron ball mallet artificially recreates the blue lightning identified as being clad by darkbeasts when rubbed like a match. However, it seems the hunters of the time weren't fond of it. And as you can see, this is a pretty straightforward translation. Still, there are a few smaller points that I think it's worth discussing. First, I'm somewhat surprised to find the item described as a Morning Star flail. Morning Stars are weapons characterized by having a round head covered in spikes directly attached to a length of metal or wood. Flails are weapons that consist of a striking head attached to a handle by a flexible rope, strap, or chain. Thus, calling the Tonitrus a peculiar iron Morning Star flail calls to mind perhaps a weapon with a handle and a detached striking head that also happens to be studded with spikes. Yet that doesn't really match with the image of the Tonitrus in the game. Instead, I would say that it more closely resembles a mace. To be fair, perhaps this is why the term peculiar was employed, though on the other hand, the Tonitrus looks fairly peculiar as a mace as well. Anyway, I bring this up not just to talk about medieval weaponry, but also because I think it gives us another interesting point of reference as to how much visual information the translation team had access to. There have been some item descriptions that have made me think maybe there was a good amount of visual information available to the translators while they were working, which you may recall from my earlier comments is an unusual state of affairs. But this makes me wonder whether there really was that much access to visual information. Perhaps it was only partially available, or maybe there were certain items someone associated with the translation got to see in action and take into account, while others remained as text or static image only. Or of course, it could be that they didn't really have any access at all. It's difficult to say for sure, but again, I wanted to bring this up as a potentially relevant piece of information in that regard. But that's not the only interesting thing about the translation of this particular item description. I also wanted to be sure and call attention to the usage of some of the verbs in that same sentence of the official English. First, note that at the beginning of the line we're told that striking this peculiar iron Morning Star flail like a match generates blue sparks. A more literal translation would begin with the term rubbing or maybe scraping, but here the more natural English equivalent phrase, strike a match, has been substituted in, and it's a change that I for one appreciate. It also fits very well with the actual motion employed in the game, which you'll have ample opportunity to observe in action as we continue to make progress. The other verb that I particularly like is the term blanket in the phrase, blue sparks that blanket a darkbeast. It's a nice way of getting at some of the meaning of the Japanese term, which I've rendered more literally as clad. Additionally, both of these terms make for an interesting contrast with the verbs employed in similar circumstances in the item description for bolt paper, which you may recall me discussing before. There, the paper is said to apply bolt to weapons when rubbed, and blue sparks are referred to as surrounding darkbeasts. Of course, it's easier to substitute strike for rub with the context of striking a match, but blanket in particular I think was well chosen here. And now...
Oh, merciful God, help me. In the name of the Healing Church, cleanse us of this horrible dream.
I think we'd better move on to discussing this new dialogue. And the thing that most strikes me here is what I'm sure by now will be a familiar issue, the use of the plural in the official English. Note the shift from what I've literally rendered, oh dear God, to, oh merciful gods, is a point that could have some pretty major ramifications. But for now, let's keep talking to this woman and see what else we can learn.
Oh, please leave me be. Don't take me, please. Oh, please, dear gods.
Okay, I won't take you anywhere. But that particular bit of translation I think was handled quite effectively. As you can see by looking at my more literal translation, the Japanese is basically just repeating itself over and over here. There's good reason for that, this woman is supposed to come across as terrified. But I like how the official version naturally renders the idea of a repeated plea not to be taken away from a terrified woman into English, even adding in that extra bit of pleading, dear gods, to convey once more that this is a religious person. See her response to the holy shawl.
Ah, by your garb, the Healing Church, you've come to save me. Oh, thank you, dear saint. words to express my relief. You can take this, at least.
Okay, thanks.
It's sure to please an upstanding member of the church like you. Oh, thank you so much, dear gods.
So, what are you doing here anyway?
Thank you so much. I was seized on the street by a hulking brute in the cathedral ward and locked up here. There were many others, but they've been taken away. And I've heard moans echoing in the distance ever since.
Funny, all I hear is the background music.
So, the hunt is on tonight. Then the streets are perilous, and every door will be shut tight. Perhaps it isn't my place to ask, but do you know somewhere that might take me in?
Nope, I'm afraid not. I have no idea.
Yes, I see. I understand. Such are the perils on a night of the hunt. I'll ask an acquaintance in the cathedral ward. Perhaps he'll open his door for me. Perhaps. Yes, I'll be fine. I do not wish to trouble you any further. You're a hunter, aren't you? I pray for success on your hunt.
Are you sure you'll be okay?
I'll be fine. I don't wish to trouble you any further. I'll ask an acquaintance in the cathedral ward. Unless you know of another place?
Okay, I guess you could go to the chapel.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll set out as soon as I can. I pray for success on your hunt, kind hunter.
So that's quite a lot of information we've got now, but I'd like to start out by returning to the point that we began with. Over the course of those lines, this character, Adela, addresses the gods, plural, 3 times. In the original Japanese, she makes a direct appeal only twice, and in both cases, the term used could be translated in the singular. The instance that appears in the English that does not appear in the Japanese is when she's begging not to be taken away, so it's a natural enough inclusion in the English, and also one that doesn't give us any real clues. Now, you may recall from the previous episode that typically the way ambiguous plurals are dealt with in cases like this is that they're assumed to be singular unless there's internal evidence to suggest that it's actually a plural, and also that it's not uncommon for the translation team to ask for clarification. As a result, it could be the case here, as elsewhere, that the translation team asked whether the Healing Church worshipped one god or several, and were given an answer that indicated to them that the plural was the way to go here. Still, once again as in other cases like this, it wouldn't hurt for us to keep an eye out in the game for whether we find any more evidence of the Healing Church acknowledging several gods in order to give some more support to this particular translation choice. However, there is something about this particular decision to switch to the plural that does add a potential complicating factor, and I wanted to bring it up because I think it also highlights an interesting aspect of localization. That is, what happens when a term has a lot of potential meaning in one cultural context and considerably less so in another? The term in question here is God, and in the US, that word has the potential to be charged with meaning in ways that it generally doesn't in Japan. Consider the Japanese game series God Eater. The first game in the series to receive an international release was called God Eater Burst in Japan, and it not only featured the phonetic katakana reading of God Eater Basto on the cover, it prominently displayed the English spelling of these same 3 words. When the international version came out a few months later in 2011, though, both the title itself and the English lettering on the cover had been changed over to God's Eater Burst. So why the name change? Well, not having been involved with the decision, I obviously can't say for sure, but what seems to be the most likely explanation, and indeed the most popular one, is that somewhere in the localization process, someone thought that literally calling a game God Eater might provoke events or court controversy in the West, and that a simple solution would be to pluralize the term God, presumably since doing so would make it clear that this was a fantasy setting involving multiple gods and take some of the potential sting out of the title. This change ultimately proved an unpopular one though, and interestingly, all of the sequels have kept the God Eater part of the title unchanged. In hindsight then, it seems clear enough that whoever made that initial decision misread the cultural reaction. Yet the instinct to identify something innocuous in one culture that might bring about undesirable results in another is important. One example of this that's purely visual might be some of the changes the Japanese government is currently considering making to the icons it uses to display what sort of buildings are present on maps that they give to international tourists. One of the more controversial changes that's been proposed involves the symbol that identifies a temple, which to a foreigner may call to mind the image of a swastika. The proposed change involves a much less charged symbol of a pagoda. Incidentally, the controversy, at least as far as I understand it, comes largely from a group of people who feel that changing a symbol long associated with Buddhism in Japan because of a Nazi alteration of it is a mistake. The point, though, is that certain words or symbols can be controversial in one context and utterly unremarkable in another, and these are things that need to be considered in the localization process. Sometimes the decisions that ultimately get made aren't the best, but I would argue that at least thinking them through falls as much under the purview of localization as decisions that get made to uncontroversial symbols that might have one meaning in one cultural context and a completely different one in another. So, to bring this back to Bloodborne, there is at least the possibility here that the term gods is being used in Adela's dialogue instead of God in order to avoid controversy. In my view, this particular reasoning behind the translation choice seems unlikely, considering the status of those great ones we discussed in the previous episode. But I did want to raise that possibility and explore some of its implications in regards to the role of localization. And now, while I'm still fighting this boss, I wanted to briefly address the translation of its name. Literally, this would come out to Black Beast Parl, and we've seen the shift from Black Beast to Dark Beast before. Interestingly, the katakana rendering of this particular boss's name, Paru, is the same as one of the Japanese pronunciations of the word pearl, the other being the native term Shinju. I'm not really sure what, if any, significance this has, except maybe to call to mind how this creature occasionally sparkles with light. In any case, I think the decision to render this parl rather than pearl in English was a wise one. It's still fairly close to the word, but avoids the potentially comedic tone of what could have been the more literal Black Beast Pearl, which I think would have been a bit at odds with the atmosphere of Bloodborne in general, and this area in particular. Having made note of that then, I'd like to get back to discussing Adela's lines, this time looking through them as we've done with other characters so far to get a sense for her voice. In the Japanese, she comes across as extremely polite, often addressing others, including our character, with formal language. A good example of this can be seen in the line where she first asks us if we know of any place that might take her in. She ends with the question, "Gozonji de wa arimasen ka?" Literally, this translates to something like the phrase, "might you not know of?" Also, she's using the honorific verb form gozonji instead of the simply polite shiteimasen ka. She also has a tendency to avoid contractions that would informalize her speech. When she asks us if we're a hunter, in the Japanese the question is phrased, "Anata wa karyudo-sama nano desho?" That last bit leading up to the question is typically shortened from nano desho to nan desho in less formal speech. And what all of this politeness adds up to, at least in my estimation, is that she is a very proper person who insists on speaking properly. Oh, and hello again, old Yarnum. Nice to see you again. But to get back to my dialogue analysis, I think the idea of Adela being a proper person is key, because while in the official English I don't quite get the same sense of politeness, I do still get an idea of this woman of being very proper and devout. When she talks about being seized on the street by a hulking brute in the cathedral ward, I get a strong sense of indignation from her. And when she thanks us for saving her, the expression, "I have no words to express my relief," similarly gives me an idea of her as someone who is attempting to be as proper as possible, especially since she continues by giving us a madman's knowledge, denigrating her own gift slightly by saying, "You could take this at least." This brings up another important aspect of her character, her devoutness, which comes across a bit more strongly than her proper politeness. Both in the original Japanese and in the English, she makes appeals to the gods and makes clear her trust for members of the Healing Church. Finally, in both the original Japanese and the official translation, it seems likely that she's willing to put up a bit of a strong front. If you inform her that you don't know of any safe places, her response in both languages displays a resignation that is likely born from disappointment, followed by her resolution to seek shelter with an acquaintance. It's clear enough she doesn't think this will work, but she insists on not wanting to trouble our character if we speak with her again. As usual then, I think the official English version of these lines handles her particular voice as a character quite well. So, now that we've taken a good long look at Adela's lines, I'd like to close out this episode with an examination of one final topic. I want to take a look back at the translation of the area name for the part of the game we've spent so much time in over the past few episodes. In the official English, this location is named on screen as Yahar Ghul, Unseen Village. A more literal rendering of the Japanese, however, might come out to Hidden Ward Yahagul. And I find the name of this location interesting for a few reasons. First, it shows what I would consider to be some good use of the flexibility to Romanize the spelling of different Japanese pronunciations. Taking the sounds Yahaguru and writing them out Yahargul is entirely within the realm of possibility, and the decision to choose this spelling as opposed to, say, Yahagru, I would argue is well justified based on the weirdness of spellings in the world of Lovecraftian fiction. Two aspects of this name I'm less sure of, though, are why this location is labeled a village and why it's said to be unseen as opposed to simply hidden away. After all, the kanji being translated here as village is the same one translated as ward in Cathedral Ward, and the area does seem more hidden away than simply unseen. Perhaps these changes were also made with an eye to Lovecraft, since his stories often involve both villages and the unseen, or perhaps it has something to do with the late-game version of this area and the role that plays in the game. Whatever the answer though, that's all the time I have for now. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them, and until next time, thanks for watching everyone.